Hi, and welcome back to the Apology Podcast. I'm Jesse Pearson, the founder and editor of Apology Magazine. Today's guest is someone who I hope will be the first of many poets to appear on the podcast. Her name is Elaine Kahn, and she just released her second collection on Soft Skull Books. The collection is called Romance, or The End. And it functions, in Elaine's words, as a kind of autopsy on a relationship from start to finish. The poems in it vary a lot in mood and tone and mode and voice. There are things that are very straightforward in it, and there are things that are more challenging. But even when the poems get a little bit abstracted, there's a sort of approachableness to the language that I really love. Elaine's work is often funny. It's very well observed. She sees the world in a very unique way, and she expresses it perfectly. My favorite kind of poetry is the kind that kind of makes the personal feel very collective. And that's what Elaine does in her work, and that's why I love it. One thing I should mention before we get started is that Elaine also teaches poetry. She does workshops in person and online. She used to teach at Pomona College here in Southern California, but now she's strictly independent. She sort of carries her poetry school around with her, I guess you could say. If you're at all inclined to take a poetry composition class, you should definitely take one of hers. You can find more at poetryfieldschool.com. Oh, and one more thing. Elaine mentions the poet Mina Loy right away when we start the podcast, and I mistake Mina Loy for Myrna Loy, the actress. So, my fault. That's who I was thinking of. So here we go. Apology Podcast with Elaine Kahn. So what are you reading right now?
Actually, last night I started reading a Mina Loy biography, which is called...
Mina Loy, the actress.
Mina Loy, the poet and painter.
Why did I think she was an actress? My God. Okay.
I don't know.
Okay. Well, tell me about her.
Well, I'm on page 8.
Well, what made you want to read it?
Well, I really like reading biographies, actually, because I think they're a very easy way to get history. Like, I read a biography of Catherine the Great once, whose life just spanned feudalism to the French Revolution, and beyond. And you just kind of learn a lot about history, about the world that way. And I have recently become interested in reading biographies specifically of women poets. I don't really know why. It just seemed interesting. I read a biography of Edna St. Vincent Millay.
Oh. What was she like?
She was really interesting. I mean, she grew up in this little town in Maine, very poor, and basically just kind of through personal charisma ended up getting scholarships to, I think it was Vassar, I think. Maybe Barnard, but I think it was Vassar. And just sort of charmed her way into the upper crust, and she was openly queer.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, so she had all, for her whole life, she had lovers of all genders, and she had this very long sort of codependent open marriage, and she had a really intense relationship with her mom, which is one of the parts I was most interested in about it. She used to call her mom the love of her life, which I relate to.
Really?
Yeah.
That's a red flag for me when I meet somebody who says that.
Oh, I'm so obsessed with my mom.
Your mom's a painter, right?
She's a painter. Yeah, she's a painter and a sculptor. Yeah. She uses multimedia.
I'm happy for you that you love her so much. That sounds great.
Well, it's not as simple as that. I do really love her, but it's also she's just a really interesting, very funny person who's, as long as I've known her, she really tries hard and laughs a lot. And I don't know, she was a good role model in certain ways.
Yeah. And in an approach to life, would you say?
That's exactly the way I think she's a good role model. Is she, I think, is someone who really taught me, or not even taught me, but I think she's responsible for a lot of my sense of humor and a lot of my ability to laugh, even when stuff is very dark. And she is a really dark person.
Mine is too,
but
in her own way.
But not in a way that's my mom's not depressed or miserable. It's more just she's a brutal realist. And she's sort of been like preparing me for her death since I was a very,
my God.
like seriously, since I was a very young child.
Wow.
But not in a way that felt like manipulative, just kind of like, this is part of life and it's not bad. It's just a part of what happens. And like, you know, when you die, like your body turns in, you know, gets broken down by the earth and like the molecules become part of different things. And like, that's really beautiful to me.
It
and
is.
she's not, I actually asked both her and my stepdad recently if they were afraid of dying. And they're both like, no, but it sucks that we won't be able to do everything we want.
That's exactly how I feel. Yeah, that's a really good way to look at it.
Yeah, I sometimes feel like a fear of death. Like
I'm
actually dying.
Oh, the act of dying.
Yeah, but they were like, no. My stepdad was like, I've seen so many people die in front of me at this point because all of his siblings have pretty much died in the last couple of years. And he was like, it's gradual and it's quite peaceful. And I was like, oh, that's good.
I mean, hopefully it is.
Yeah,
anyway,
yeah.
We're getting deep on death
sorry.
here. No, I like it. I think that's really cool, though, you're the way you feel about your mother, because I think many, many people define themselves in opposition to their parents and how they are. So that's refreshing.
Yeah.
Yeah. What other biographies of poets have really sort of stuck in your head, regardless of gender?
Well, those are the only two I've read. This was sort of I think those are the only two I've read.
Oh, wow.
I have liked reading biographies, but this was sort of a new thing, was me being like, I'm just going to specifically seek them out. I also just read, it's not a biography, but it's this book called New People by Danzy Senna, who it turned out, I figured out after I read it, is the daughter of Fanny Howe, which was really strange.
Yeah.
And then I read tons of poetry.
Yeah.
I read... Yeah.
That's mostly what you read.
I guess it is mostly what I read.
How do you, as a poet, first approach a poem by somebody else? What's your sort of reading process for something new?
I mean, I don't know if I exactly have a reading process. I guess I read and I feel very comfortable not connecting to parts of poems and then just sort of keeping myself open for all of a sudden that line or that moment that hits me. And I would say that's really, it's like I read a poem sort of the way you might like listen to a song or something.
Yeah.
It's just, I'm kind of like, all right, here's this thing. I'm just going through it. And then all of a sudden I'll be like, oh, that was amazing.
Right. It's like a sort of openness.
Yeah. I don't put a lot of pressure. I'm certainly not one of those readers who's like, well, what does this mean? Or like, what are they trying to say with this metaphor? I'm just not really interested in that. And poems, in fact, where I feel like I'm being kind of directed to decode them, I don't tend to really respond to. I just like, I'll just look for that thing that grabs me, that resonates, and then look for the next thing. And I kind of consider the parts in between either just like, it's like the stillness in a movie, like when you have like a scene in a movie that's just kind of the in-between, the traveling. It's just kind of like that. And then I just sort of, I just like let it like wash over me. And then all of a sudden I'm yanked into the poem. And I really like that. And it's a pretty low pressure way to read also.
Yeah. I kind of love that. It's a new way of thinking of it for me, because I definitely read. I feel like a compulsion to understand as much as I can.
I don't feel that at all. I really don't. I mean, I don't even feel like I necessarily understand my own poems. I don't think that poetry, I don't think the way that it has meaning is direct. I think that it's much more intuitive. I think it's much more like not exactly subconscious, but there's a term I use when I'm teaching peripheral consciousness. I think a lot of the way poetry interacts with us and communicates is sort of, it's talking to a peripheral consciousness that's like, you know, sort of like your second brain or something. And that's what I really like about poetry, is that I don't think it is, I mean, I always think like if you could say a poem, if you could explain a poem very simply using just straightforward prose or in an essay or any, why, do that.
Why is it a poem?
Yeah, well, I'm not interested in complicating meaning. I think of poetry as being actually a very direct form of meaning that's just not normative.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. I should clarify, too. I think that the ones I feel compelled to understand are the ones that are especially occluded, difficult to understand.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? When something like the most tangled John Ashbery thing comes in front of me, I really want to get it.
Yeah.
But I feel like I'm deficient somehow. But my favorite poetry is very direct poetry,
Yeah.
usually.
I also think, like, I don't know. Like, I mean, I really like John Ashbery, but I don't, like I said, like I'm just sort of, I just move through the poems and then there'll be a moment I connect to. And I can't imagine really being like, what, you know, when poems start to feel like riddles or something, I'm just like, eh.
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe that's a deficiency on my part. I should be more.
I don't think so. I think you've just kind of given me permission to read them the way I should be reading them. But what about when you are reading work by your students? Is that a different sort of approach at first, or is it the same thing as any poem?
I mean, it's the same as any poem, except that, you know, I'm reading it with more of an editor's eye, like looking for things that I think aren't working or things that I think are working and trying to highlight them or make them sharper in the poem. But I definitely it doesn't bother me if people turn in work that I don't really, you know, quote, get it, unquote. Like, I give my students a lot of leeway, and I just sort of will tell them like, oh, this is the part I really connected with, and this sort of pushed me out of the poem and sent me sort of somewhere else that didn't feel generative to me. And
I like that, generative. What do you mean when you use that word, like in this context?
I mean, like so I say a poem that kind of pushed you off the page into somewhere else. And like, that can be a really good thing. Like it can send you into like sort of a thought circle that's really interesting and still kind of keeps you connected to the poem, or can kind of send you someplace where you're just like, wait, what did that? Do you think that was a typo? Like, but seriously,
yeah,
like,
yeah,
you know,
sure.
and they're different ways. Like, I think you can be pushed out of a poem in a way that actually serves the poem, or you can be pushed out of a poem in a way that just makes you stop reading.
Yeah.
Another thing I've learned through teaching actually is that I'm not that into metaphor, or at least not metaphors that sort of like read as metaphors.
That's interesting because I wrote down some things that were metaphorical, I thought, in your work that really felt so authentic to me.
I believe, I'm sure that they're in there, but it's a thing I've noticed, like when metaphors are too kind of loud, I'm curious to know. I'm curious to know.
Yeah, I'm looking for the ones that I really like. So some of the sort of metaphors or descriptors or symbolic things that I saw that I liked were, at one point you described warmth as hard.
Yeah.
You talk about a careening bell.
Yeah.
You say casual as rape, thin as sleep, blue as cutting scissors. And all those things, none of them drove me away. They all felt, there was a sense of rightness to them. Like they were like kind of grabbed out of the cosmos or something.
Yeah. I mean, I guess those are metaphors, but they don't feel metaphoric to me. They feel more like defining or like characterizing. Like I forget the first one you said.
Warmth as blue.
The warmth of my heart. And blue is cutting scissors. So the warmth of my heart is hard and unending. That's the line.
Right.
That doesn't feel metaphoric to me. That feels like me just trying to really accurately describe something, and that often looks like it's a metaphor or it looks like it's, you know, a construction. But that's me actually just trying to be really direct.
Yeah.
And same with thin as sleep. Like I'm like a total insomniac and like a really light sleeper, and that's
so it's personal. It's very personal.
Yeah, but it's me trying to communicate. It's not, and I'm not trying to communicate by being like it's like this. I'm saying like it is that. Like literally, like the warmth of my heart is hard. I'm like my sleep is thin.
Well, I think these things really succeed because they're so personal to you, but they felt there's some kind of universality about them.
Yeah, Allen Ginsberg has this. I listened to a talk he gave at, I think, Naropa many, many years ago, where he talks about the dangers of abstraction in poetry. And he says, when in doubt, take it back to the optic. Meaning like when in doubt, like return to your senses, like listen to what it actually is, look at it, listen to it, touch it. Don't just try to like make up something that seems sort of like ornamentally interesting.
Yeah, that'll be inauthentic.
Or I think it's his point was really that people won't be able to connect to it because it's not. It comes out of sort of a fantasy that you're experiencing that's really personal, and whereas opposed to like it can still be personal, but if it's like personal information that's coming from your senses, there's a much better chance that it's concrete and that other people will connect to it. They'll have a feeling of like, oh yeah, that is what that's like, as opposed to being like, I can't make sense of that.
Yeah, and then you're kind of driven away as a reader. I saw that you described your poetry field school as providing practical training on subjects previously learned theoretically. I really like that, but can you talk a little bit about what that means to you?
I think that might have been a...
Is that outdated or something?
No, but I think that's like a definition of field school. When I was trying to figure out what to call my poetry school, I was, trying to figure out a name, and the idea of poetry field school came to my mind. I was like, okay, well, what is a field school actually? And I think that's the definition of what a field school is. It is about hands-on, direct learning, as opposed to just like reading about concepts. And that's absolutely what I wanted my school to be. I wanted it to be. I'm always telling my students, this is a utilitarian space. Like this is,
that's great.
But it's what I want. It's like this is a place where I want you to generate new work. I want you to make the work that you do have sharper. I want you to grow more comfortable in your skills as an editor. It's not about just sort of, we don't do a lot of why is poetry this way? Or it's really just about like make work and make the work that you do have better. And then of course the idea of the field in poetry was the other thing that sent me towards that name, because and poetry, we call the page the field, or a page as field. Yeah. So it was a way of also referring to that.
Wow. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Do your students come from all walks of life?
Mm-hmm.
That must be great.
It's amazing. I'm still kind of in shock that it's worked out and gone as well as it has. But yeah, I get a really, really wide variety of students. I've had, people in their 60s to people in high school. And I just started offering classes that are in European time zones. So now I have all these students. I have someone signed up for my next class who lives in Georgia.
Nice.
Like in
in Russia. Yeah, sort of in Russia.
Yeah. But yeah, and I had a student in Australia last session. And, I have some people who have MFAs, some people who've never really written before. I can't believe how well it usually works out, too. Everyone ends up always kind of bonding and having a lot to offer, sort of no matter where they come from.
So it's like a workshop. They all dialogue with each other.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's held on Skype, and it's just like we're in the same room. It's just you read your poem, you get verbal feedback on it, and then there's kind of a period of time for the author to offer clarifications or ask questions. But it's pretty. It's great. I do offer them I teach out of my apartment too. And then I was at Pomona last year, and I'm going to be teaching in London for like a quick workshop in the spring. So I do teach in-person stuff also.
Since you do it so much, I'm assuming it also helps your writing process, or is that a cliche?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's something I was really worried about when I started teaching so much, because I teach so much. Yeah. Like I teach just an astonishing amount. I have totally lost count of the number of students I've had in the last 3 years alone, but it's definitely, it's probably like 300 or something.
Wow.
It's really a lot. And I didn't know, like, at first, is this going to make me burned out on poetry or not want to write or not have, I don't know, or will I just start writing work that's sort of like informed by my students? Like, you just don't know. But I feel like it has helped me as a writer because, first of all, I read much more than I would have otherwise because I'm just always trying to get new material for my students. And I think that really helps. But also it's just given me this kind of like objective, almost mechanical relationship with language where I feel very much like I understand how it works and how to move it around and how to like do things with it that maybe you're not supposed to, or that we're not taught to do things that we're not taught to do with language.
Yeah. It's like the understanding becomes complete enough that you can then do those things that aren't right.
Well, I guess it reminds me of
Quote,
like
unquote, right.
People who are like athletes, like surfers or musicians, people who kind of are like, oh, like I'm really at one with my surfboard when I surf, or I'm like really at one with my instrument. That's kind of how I've started feeling, is I'm just so much like inside of language all the time, just like working with it all the time, that I like sometimes I'm like a wizard. like I'm just like, this is my medium that's become so second nature to me. I don't feel that way with like talking, talking something. It's always a little bit, I can be very shy and stuff. But in terms of writing, I just feel such just like freedom.
That's incredible.
To just kind of work with language in whatever ways interest me or
I'm thinking about when Neo first sees the Matrix. Remember that?
Yes. Yeah.
Like the code in front of his eyes.
No, totally. It's like that. And then he learns how to just change it with his mind. You can just
fly. Yeah. As you become more and more accomplished, do you feel the deeper confidence in your work?
I mean, I think I feel, like I was saying before, I think I feel more freedom now. But I don't know if confidence exactly applies. Like when I write a poem that I'm really satisfied with, it's an incredible feeling, and that poem means a lot to me. But I've never really had a lot of thoughts about how other people will perceive my work, so it's almost like I haven't really thought of it before.
Yeah. That might be a good space to be in.
Yeah.
For a poet especially.
Yeah. People, because that's a question people ask me a lot, is like, well, like, how did you think the reader would interpret this? I'm like, I don't know. I just didn't. This book, I did think about the reader more than I did in my first book, certainly, but that was in the construction of the book. Like this, the book has a form that's really, it's kind of like heavy. It's like a heavy structure. And so that I was kind of like, well, how can I make this legible? Or how can I wanted to very much make it something that could be read through sort of uninterruptedly.
I kind of want to see if you are cool with getting a little bit dishy about poets.
I mean, we'll see.
Tell me, if you will, an overrated poet.
I mean, Rupi Kaur is someone I was just very much going off about.
Okay, talk to me.
I mean, I think it's great for people to connect, to find, I don't know, like meaning or a sense of recognition in anything. I think that's great. She was recently declared, I think, like the writer of the decade by, I don't know if it was like the New Republic or like some like pretty big.
That's odd.
It was odd. And, I just like, I kind of don't, I mean, I think she writes kind of like I don't think her writing it doesn't do the things that excite me about poetry. I think of her writing as much more being kind of like, not even aphoristic actually, but it's kind of like, it's a little bit self-helpy. It's kind of just like, it's motivational. That's what it is. It's kind of like motivational, sort of like pop psychology. It doesn't really use language in any ways that exploit the fact that language is so unstable or compressed. It doesn't use images I find exciting. And I think the other reason I take some issue with her work is that because it's so unadventurous in the ways that it uses language, I think it kind of, it underscores this idea that in order for poetry to be accessible, it needs to be like kind of boring.
Yeah.
And what I really want is for people to feel more comfortable being moved by things that they don't necessarily understand in the way that we're used to understanding things. I think that's something that's a useful thing to give yourself permission to do. And I think it's something that's also, it's really powerful. Like, I don't think people should feel turned off by something just because they don't, get it. It's like, I feel sort of like that's like a boring answer to say Rupi Kaur, but it just like, she doesn't really work with language.
I think you really nail something by calling like her sort of a self-help poet.
Yeah.
And I think that this cultural moment of like TED Talks and everybody's an entrepreneur kind of asks for a self-help poet in a sort of mainstream place.
Yeah. And it's also like, I don't take any issue with the fact that she uses Instagram. I think that's great. I don't have any problems with her writing short poems. I think that's great. I think it's great she uses plain language. She just doesn't use language as a medium. She's not making like artwork. She's just not exploring the possibilities of language and the possibilities of like helping people connect to things that maybe are outside their comfort zone. And I think that's really important. I think that's a thing poetry actually does, is it can help people feel able to just respond without necessarily understanding.
What about an underrated poet, whether they're later in their career or young or dead or anything?
I think that's almost all poets. I think that, this is part of what I was saying with Rupi Kaur actually, is like, I think that the majority of people would find so much pleasure and satisfaction from reading a lot of poetry that is considered quite esoteric. If only we had if we were not socialized to feel like this one mode of engaging with literature, this one mode of understanding was the only way.
Mm-hmm. A literal sort of way of approaching things.
Yeah. Like, I remember in high school and stuff, like the first poems I was assigned, they would always say like, the assignment was like, what does this mean? And that's not a real question. That's not a useful question to me.
The question should be a little more like, how does this make you feel?
I don't even know if there should be a question. Yeah. It's just kind of like, just read it. And like, I don't know, what did it do? What was that experience like? Yeah. If you have to ask a question, but I don't know what, yeah.
Is there a poet who you've totally changed your opinion about, for good or for ill?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Louise Glick, I think. I hadn't read like a ton of her work, but I just, what I had read, I was like, this is just kind of like, traditional narrative poetry. And then I picked up her book at Skylight, actually, and was flipping through it. And I was like, this is really weird and like exciting and like bitchy, and just got really into it. And yeah, kind of just read her whole collected a few weeks ago.
Wow. Is that something that needed to happen at this point in your life? Like, you couldn't have felt that way about it before?
I think that I felt a lot more. My first poetry education really was in undergraduate college. I went to art school and in the Bay Area, and there was a lot of emphasis on like experimental writing and like writing that's sort of eschewed. Is that how you say it? Eschewed? Yeah, I think so. Eschewed narrative. And so I think I might have kind of like turned my nose up at it in the past, just sort of as for like aesthetic reasons. But at this point, I'm just a lot more open. I just kind of it's if it's good, it's good. I mean, I love pop music, and I also love like very strange experimental music.
Right.
Like you don't have to pick. Like,
yeah. Who is a favorite lyricist of yours?
I mean, I feel like I'm like tempted to just shout out friends of mine, but
That's fine too.
Yeah, I mean, I do think I actually do really like my friend Kim Gordon. I think her lyrics actually are quite good.
Yeah.
Her most recent album, just there's so much strangeness and juxtaposition and humor in her lyrics. I really like that.
I always really liked the way that she would sort of pull from literature and drop it in there, like Dennis Johnson, I think, in a song on Daydream Nation. And you wouldn't know that it was him unless you read that book.
Yeah.
I read the book a few years later. I was like, oh my God, this is that song.
Kim is someone who I think has a similar relationship to language as me, in that like we're both kind of like interested in it and recognize that it's all over the place and sort of just constantly plucking from it. I think that's, yeah, I like that she does that.
It's a kind of appropriation.
Totally. Yeah. Appropriation and not like displacement, like, and looking how different things are in different contexts.
When did you first know you wanted to be a poet? How old were you?
I mean, I always wrote poetry. I wrote poetry my whole life.
Since you can remember life.
Yeah. I mean, really bad. It's really, really bad. But I never really feel like I made the decision to be a poet. It all seems almost entirely kind of like random, which, you know, looking back, that's like ridiculous. Like I did apply to grad school for an MFA, but it never occurred to me certainly that I could make my living as a poet or as a poetry teacher. I never really wanted to be in academia. I think I like just always kind of assumed at some point I'd become a lawyer.
Wow.
Which I have no idea why, except that both my parents have law degrees. And it just sort of, I was like, well, you know, sometime I'll probably like smarten up and like do something normal.
And being a lawyer, that's interesting because that's another job where you really work with language and twist language a lot of the time too.
That's actually really true. Although I never thought of it like that. That's one of the things one of the things that's made teaching feel more important to me is the way language gets manipulated and exploited by people in power.
Which is happening a lot now.
It's happening a ton. And it's always happened, but I sort of became aware of it in a new way. And wanting to kind of help people be able to identify that and also understand how they can also take advantage of that. Like language is not stable. The meanings are not fixed. Communication happens on much more subtle levels than we're consciously aware of. And if you can start to understand that, like you can start to ideally like recognize when you're being manipulated via language, and also like, you know, use those skills to fight back in some small ways.
Yeah, and be less resistant to new language as well. I think it's because that stuff happens in increments. It's not like Old English became Middle English overnight. It's a process, right?
Yeah.
So would you mind reading me a poem from the book?
Sure. So this is the title poem of the book, and it's called Romance, or The End. This is a book about love. And it is a book about lies. Love can be a lie, but it is also always true. This is a book about truth. This is a book about story. There is no such thing as a true story, and so there are no stories in this book. Without a story, there is separation. This is a book about separation. Everything is a story, even the truth. There is nothing truer in this world than the lie of love.
I love that.
Thanks.
It has a sort of There's a real authority in that poem to me. Like you're leading us down this train of thought that feels very, it flip-flops back and forth again and again. But I feel like you are right about these things somehow because of the way it's just so stated so clearly or something like that.
That is a rare poem that I actually just sat down and wrote. Like most of my poems are very labored over and like take forever. But that was actually written, I mean, it says this is a book about, and I was trying to say what this book is about. And originally it was actually, and now it's in the back of the book, but originally I had thought of it as being sort of an introduction. And I just wanted to like kind of succinctly say, honestly, like what I was trying to do with the book.
That makes sense to me. I mean, I don't know, the way that I started to read the book as I got deeper into it was that it was kind of a post-mortem on a love affair, like tracing it from being alone to meeting a person to all the way to being back alone again. Is that fair? Or
I mean, yeah, that's how it's structured, like the book says, like it's a story. Like it's not, it is, I think you said post-mortem, I think of it sometimes kind of like an autopsy, but it also like, it wasn't written chronologically. That happens through the structure of the book. And that is what I wanted to kind of do, was look at, I've always loved romance and romantic narratives. And I kind of wanted to try to write one that felt honest to me. And it has like an interruption in the middle where the story kind of gets like blown apart, and that's also part of reality. Like that was one of the things I wanted to capture in this book, is that like stories aren't clean. Like the narrative of someone's life, like that has moments where all of a sudden it's just sort of shattered, and you have to figure out how to incorporate that back into the story of who you are, of yourself, in order to kind of move on, in order to not be angry all the time, to just, I don't know, to like get to the next place of peace, which I think is something I really wish for in my life and wished for with this book. And so I tried to like write a story that just felt like true and honest, even while also acknowledging that there's a lot of stuff in it it's not a report.
Right.
It's like it's an emotional narrative, and it's been constructed in a certain way because it's the way I wanted it to be.
Yeah. I mean, I think it really works that way also because there are numerous kinds of poems in the book. There are very straightforward ones, like August. I really like that.
Yeah.
That feels like new love to me, that poem. It's nice. And then there are poems that are, like we were saying earlier, somewhat riddle-like, and you have to sort of take them on their own terms. And that's how it is in love, right? We all approach it with all these different sort of minds. Sometimes we're crazy, sometimes we're rational. What's some other classical romantic literature you read? Did you read Romeo and Juliet again?
No, I mean, I like thought of it certainly,
Yeah,
but
you reference it in a title, right?
Romeo and Juliet and Elaine.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
that's something I've been trying to work that into a poem for so long. I thought of it a few years ago and just cracks me up
That's
for
good.
some reason.
Yeah, it's good.
But I read a lot of Sappho also, through someone I kind of reread a lot. But yeah, I think the main things I was reading during this were like Tennyson. Like I looked at like Tristan and Isolde, and I think I read some of Shakespeare's like love sonnets, and I did actually, part of the way I got the structure was I was looking at diagrams of classic Greek tragedy.
Oh, wow.
And like trying to actually figure out how to organize the book according to those rules, which it's not like faithful to exactly, but it follows a very similar trajectory.
Yeah. I saw you say somewhere else that you like to try to write in sestina form.
I love it. Yeah.
Can you describe that for?
So sestinas it's a very kind of traditional, formal poetic structure where it's 6 stanzas, there's 6 end lines, and every stanza has the same 6 end words, but they're in a different order in every stanza. And it's just like, it's basically like a really intricate pattern. And I actually go a step further and I do it all in iambic pentameter, which is just nuts.
Can you explain that?
Well, so it's just writing 6 lines of iambic pentameter with the same end word. But I'm not really interested in like staying loyal to like the rules for sestina structure. I use it as kind of like a processing like tool. Like it's like what are they like on the internet? Like when you put like something in and it like spits it out in a different way.
AI, like an AI generative.
Yeah, like a generator. Exactly. Yeah.
Are you a fan of the Romantic poets? Keats and Coleridge and Wordsworth, or is that just too...
I don't think I've like ever really read them.
Yeah.
Honestly, which is horrible, especially Keats. I feel like so many of the writers I like reference him. But I am a fan of Tennyson, who's the epigraph of this book, and there's sort of like quotes from his poem Lancelot and Elaine sprinkled all throughout the book, or in a few places at least. And he was actually the first poet I read ever when I was like a really little kid. At the library, I found one of his books and it was little and it, had gold, like gilt.
Right.
And he has this poem, Lancelot and Elaine. And, my name's Elaine. So I was immediately drawn to it. And I certainly didn't used to read poetry with any sense of like connection or understanding. I just was drawn to the romanticism of it.
Yeah.
And it was really interesting returning to that poem, the Lancelot and Elaine poem, and as a older writer, someone who's a lot more familiar and comfortable with poetry, and realizing just like how totally wild it is as a poem and how fresh the language is. Yeah. Like that epigraph.
Yeah. Can you read that?
Yeah.
Here, I have it open.
It's, "Stay with me. I am sick. My love is more than many diamonds."
That's amazing.
Yeah. I mean, and when it felt like exactly the right way to frame the book, and like the way that, the thing is also like, there's something, so Tennyson, his romances, or the romances in his poetry, they're usually tragedies. And that's like something that I sort of came to think as being pretty honest. I mean, not to say that like relationships are tragedies, but there is something about that kind of like wild love that I don't think like can endure in a like, I don't know, like it's like either like you kind of have to figure out how to just live with someone without like losing your mind, which is what people in romances do. They're like losing their fucking minds all the time. Like, or someone has to die, or like some other kind of tragedy has to just sever it.
Right.
And that like, this book was written about a certain experience I had that it was extremely romantic. And then, something happened that just exploded it. And I was like, it was horrible. I mean, it was horrible, but it was also, I don't think it like could have gone on the way it was either. And there was a part of me that was like, well, maybe it's better that it just got like totally destroyed by this like external event that had nothing to do with the relationship. Then
you're making me really, really curious.
I'm not going to get into it. Okay. But it's, I mean, I think some readers probably will pick up on it in the book, but it's like, it seemed like in some ways, even though it was like insanely painful, it was like, I was glad that like we never had to fall out of love. There's something that seemed more horrible about that in a certain way.
Has the person that you're speaking about looked at the book?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
what's that like?
I mean, for me, it's fine. I think he has some weird feelings about it, but not like, I mean, he knows that I wrote it and he received like advanced copies of it. Yeah. And, what happened, like it really, really affected both of us. It was not just like my experience alone. And I don't know. And it's my hope that he doesn't feel like to put on display in this book, but that he does, I don't know, in some ways see it as like a tribute to certain things we shared.
I mean, I think it's incredibly loving in many parts.
In many parts.
In others, it's not.
Yeah.
I think that, what you were saying about this sort of like the only ways for love to end are in like death or pain or something like that feels kind of encapsulated for me in this poem, I braided pearls into my hair, but I did not have a wedding. It's very short. Would you read it for me?
Sure. I braided pearls into my hair, but I did not have a wedding. I've actually never read this out loud.
Oh, wow.
So it says whispered.
Yeah, there's this direction here that says to whisper the poem.
Marriage is two people who love each other. So they say a vow to devour one another, head to toe, in the cruelest manner possible.
It's pretty right.
I mean, it's not like I don't want to make it like I'm in a relationship now currently with someone I love very much. So I'm not like against romantic love at all, but I think I had in other times in my life a more kind of like self-destructive engagement with romantic love that I did, I kind of like really had to acknowledge that. I mean, when I was a little kid, I was obsessed with love stories, like just obsessed. Like all I read were like Arthurian legends and like a historical fiction and sci-fi fantasy where like just people just fell in love and then, one of them died or the book ended. Yeah. And it was like it was, I think, kind of my idea of love, like it didn't get past this like kind of like shared psychosis and figuring out like, okay, how can you like have love that also like leaves space for the individual self, and like love that like leaves space for like a life and like it was something I kind of was like, okay, that's important to me. I don't want to just like be losing my mind all the time. Like I want to live. I want to have like a good, healthy, happy life. And that's not me like, I don't feel like that's me like giving up or like losing hope. Like it's just about like what do I want to do with my life? Like I want to do a lot. I don't need my romantic relationship to be the central drama of my being.
And that's it for today. Thanks for listening, and thanks to Elaine for coming out and doing the interview. Elaine is going on tour this month, February of 2020. I'm sure you can find more at Soft Skull's website. I know she's going to hit Providence and New York City and Boston, and I think Powell's in Portland. So yeah, look that up. She's a great reader. You should really go see. A couple more things. I've gotten a lot of feedback on the first few episodes of the podcast, and it's mostly been great, and I really appreciate it. A couple of requests have come up, though, repeatedly. One is that I put show notes online for each episode, so all the books that are talked about can be found in one place. So starting with this episode, I'll do that. It'll be at shopapology.com in the podcast section. I am well aware that is a very tacky URL. I also own apologymagazine.com, but through a bunch of Byzantine screw-ups with web servers and hosts. You don't want to hear about it, but it's a thing. It's a whole thing. Secondly, numerous people have asked for more diversity in my guests. I totally agree with that, and you'll find more of that coming as the podcast progresses. I guess for the first few episodes I just kind of went to friends I could get to easily, and they all happen to be white dudes. But there'll be a wide range of voices as the podcast continues. And thanks to everyone for getting in touch and pointing that out. This episode was recorded by me at home in Mount Washington, Los Angeles. It was edited and cleaned up by Justin Geller through the kind mediation of Laris Kreslins. And the music is all Bach, arranged and performed by Cyrus Garamani. Thanks a lot for listening. I'll see you next time.